air of deep reverence that sat on the faces of the elders of the Indian family, as they listened to the voices of their children singing praise and glory to the God and Saviour they had learned to fear and love. The Indians seem most tender parents. It is pleasing to see the affectionate manner in which they treat their young children, fondly and gently caressing them with eyes overflowing and looks of love. During the singing, each papoose crept to the feet of its respective father and mother, and those that were too young to join their voices to the little choir remained quite silent till the hymn was at an end. One little girl, a fat brown roly poly of 3 years old, beat time on her father's knee, and from time to time chimed in her infant voice. She evidently possessed a fine ear and a natural taste for music. I was at a loss to conceive where the Indians kept their stores, clothes, and other movables, the wigwam being so small that there seemed no room for anything besides themselves and their hounds. Their ingenuity, however, supplied the want of room, and I soon discovered a plan that answered all the purposes of closets, bags, boxes, etc., the inner lining of birch bark being drawn between the poles so as to form hollow pouches all round. In these pouches were stowed their goods. One set held their stock of dried deer's flesh, another dried fish, a third contained some flat cakes, which I have been told they bake in a way peculiar to themselves, with hot ashes over and under. For my part I think they must be far from palatable, so seasoned. Their dressed skins, clothes, materials for the various toys, such as beads, quills, bits of cloth, silk, and 1,000 other miscellaneous articles, occupied the rest of these reservoirs. Though open for a considerable space at the top, the interior of the wigwam was so hot I could scarcely breathe, and was constrained to throw off all my wrappings during the time we stayed. Before we went away the hunter insisted on showing us a game, which was something after the manner of our cup and ball, only more complicated, and requires more sleight of hand. The Indians seemed evidently well pleased at our want of adroitness. They also showed us another game, which was a little like ninepins, only the number of sticks stuck in the ground was greater. I was unable to stay to see the little rows of sticks knocked out, as the heat of the wigwam oppressed me almost to suffocation. I was glad to feel myself once more breathing the pure air. In any other climate one would scarcely have undergone such sudden extremes of temperature without catching a severe cold; but fortunately that distressing complaint, catching le cold, as the Frenchman termed it, is not so prevalent in Canada as at home. Some 20 years ago, while feeling of dread still existed in the minds of the British settlers towards the Indians, from the remembrances of atrocities committed during the war of independence, a poor woman, the widow of a settler who occupied a farm in one of the then but thinly settled townships back of the Ontario, was alarmed by the sudden appearance of an Indian within the walls of her log hut. He had entered so slightly that it was not till he planted himself before the blazing fire that he was perceived by the frightened widow and her little ones, who retreated, trembling with ill concealed terror, to the furthest corner of the room. Without seeming to notice the dismay which his appearance had excited, the Indian proceeded to disencumber himself from his hunting accoutrements. He then unfastened his wet moccasins, which he hung up to dry, plainly intimating his design was to pass the night beneath their roof, it being nearly dark and snowing heavily. Scarcely daring to draw an audible breath, the little group watched the movements of their unwelcome guest. Imagine their horror when they beheld him take from his girdle a hunting knife and deliberately proceed to try its edge. After this his tomahawk and rifle underwent a similar examination. The despair of the horror stricken mother was now approaching a climax. She already beheld in idea the frightful mangled corpses of her murdered children upon that hearth which had so often been the scene of their innocent gambols. Instinctively she clasped the two youngest to her breast at a forward movement of the Indian. With streaming eyes she was about to throw herself at his feet, as he advanced towards her with the dreaded weapons in his hands, and implored his mercy for herself and her babes. What then was her surprise and joy when he gently laid the rifle, knife, and tomahawk beside her, signifying by this action that she had nothing to fear at his hands. Note. It is almost an invariable custom now for the Indians on entering a dwelling house to leave all their weapons, as rife, tomahawk, etc., outside the door, even if the weather be ever so wet, as they consider it unpolite to enter a family dwelling armed. A reprieve to a condemned criminal at the moment previous to his execution was not more welcome than this action of the Indian to the poor widow. Eager to prove her confidence and gratitude at the same time, she hastened to prepare food for the refreshment of the now no longer dreaded guest, and assisted by the eldest of her children, put clean sheets and the best blankets on her own bed, which she joyfully devoted to the accommodation of the stranger. An expressive "Hugh! Hugh!" was the only reply to this act of hospitality. But when he was to take possession of his luxurious couch he seemed sorely puzzled. It was evident that the Indian had never seen, and certainly never reposed on, an European bed. After a mute examination of the bedclothes for some minutes, with a satisfied laugh he sprang upon the bed, and curling himself up like a dog, in a few minutes was sound asleep. By dawn of day the Indian had departed, but whenever he came on the hunting grounds in the neighbourhood of the widow she was sure to see him. The children, no longer terrified at his swarthy countenance and warlike weapons, would gather round his knees, admire the feathered pouch that contained his shot, finger the beautiful embroidered sheath that held the hunting knife, or the finely worked moccasins and leggings, whilst he would pat their heads and bestow upon them an equal share of caresses with his deer-hounds. Such was the story related to me by a young missionary. I thought it might prove not uninteresting as a trait of character of one of these singular people. Chiboya, for that was the name of the Indian, was one of the Chippewas of Rice Lake, most of whom are now converts to Christianity, and making considerable advancement in civilization and knowledge of agriculture. Hunting and fishing, however, appear to be their favourite pursuits. For these they leave the comfortable houses at the Indian villages, and return at stated times to their forest haunts. I believe it is generally considered that their numbers are diminishing, and some tribes have become nearly if not totally extinct in the Canadas. The race is slowly passing away from the face of the earth, or mingling by degrees with the colonists, till, a few centuries hence, even the names of their tribes will scarcely remain to tell that they once existed. Note. It is stated that the North West Company had a census of all the tribes, and that the whole Indian population of that immense continent did not now exceed 100,000 souls. In a parliamentary document of 1834 the Indians of Lower Canada are estimated at 3,437, and those of Upper Canada at 13,700, which latter number is stated to include those on the shores of Lake Huron and to the westward. Editor. When next you send a box or parcel, let me have a few good tracts and hymn books, as they prize a gift of this sort extremely. I send you a hymn, the one they sang to us in the wigwam. It is the Indian translation, and written by the hunter, Peter's eldest son. He was delighted when I told him I wanted him to copy it for me, that I might send it across the seas to my own country, that English people might see how well Indians could write. The hunchback Maquin has made me a miniature canoe of birch bark, which I send. You will prize it as a curiosity and token of remembrance. The red and black squirrel skins are for Jane, the feather fans and papers of feathers for Sarah. Tell the latter, the next time I send a packet home, she will have specimens fit for stuffing of our splendid redbird, which, I am sure, is the Virginian nightingale. It comes in May or April, and leaves us late in the summer. It exactly corresponds to a